so I think sort of like the union of those two things, like me having that travel experience in Panama, where it was, I really couldn't understand what people were saying, despite having some background with Spanish. And then also just sort of getting involved in the Latin dance community that really just sort of brought everything together for me. And then Spanish was just a part of my life. So it was natural for me to put some effort towards getting better.
You say it was part of your life. Mm-hmm. Tell me a bit more about that. Was that because of the Spanish in the music, or because of the people you met when you were dancing? What did that look like?
It's really all of the above. I mean, I think that's the thing about music. It's part of culture, right? Language is also part of culture. These things don't exist in a vacuum. So as I became exposed to the music, first through, sort of like a Zumba class, but then later actually going to classes, meeting people, being a part of the community. It's a really diverse community, but there obviously are people who are native Spanish speakers that dance Latin dance. And I was just meeting people. I was listening to the music. I was dancing to it. I wanted to understand it because there were all these amazing songs, and I'd be singing along sometimes, and sometimes I knew the words, sometimes I didn't. I was just sort of faking it. And but I was really driven to understand what it was I was saying. So it became just sort of a natural thing because I was going out dancing all the time. I was listening to the music when I wasn't out dancing. I was taking classes and I was meeting people. So I just decided, I'm going to make an effort to speak more, to practice, to learn not just the songs, but how to have a conversation. So it really did it gave me a natural reason to want to learn the language, other than just sort of, it would be fun to do, right? It was just, I was always around it and always being exposed to it. So it was more natural for me to incorporate the culture in that way.
You've got that dual prong of motivation and consistency as well, which is sometimes so hard to manufacture if you don't have this reason why. So on the one hand, you're really motivated because you've got this thing that you love, but then through the community and that routine, you then got consistency. So you're actually just showing up every day or a few times a week, and then you're just getting that as part of your life. And it's really easy to see in that way how the language can kind of just follow, not without work, of course, but it's the perfect scenario for you to kind of develop a knowledge of the language. So when you think of Spanish, what does music mean for you? What does, I'm not entirely sure what I'm asking here, but often people ask me the question, how does music, is there a link between music and languages? And it's a very difficult question to answer, but when you think of Spanish, do you think of music, or vice versa? When you think of music, do you think of Spanish?
It's interesting for me. I always tell people that, because sometimes people ask like, well, how do you learn a language through music? Because sometimes doesn't the music get in the way, right? Like the melody, and like I'm focused on that, not necessarily the words. But there's a few things I'd say about that. One, just from sort of when we're like toddlers, right, or babies, and our first sort of language activity, a lot of our early language memories have melody and have rhythm and have music. I always ask people like, okay, if I were to ask you what letter in the alphabet comes after O, right? A lot of times in your head, you have this like internal dialogue where you're singing the alphabet song, right? O-M-N-O-P-P, right? So there's so many links we have, and music has this way of just getting into our brains and not letting go of our memories. And the emotional component of that also sort of latches onto us because we have these memories that are important to us, or they're pivotal to our lives. So I think that our earliest memories of language actually do have a lot to do with music, and with Spanish in particular. And and I'm not sure sort of how it is in Spain as much, because my experience is more of Latin America, but Latino culture is like so imbued with music. I mean, if you go to a party or a get together, there's always music playing, people are dancing, and it doesn't have to be a dance party. I think people kind of misunderstand it, like, oh, you're at a club. No, it's dinner. Like, we're just having dinner. There's music playing and let's dance right now. I mean, it's just such a part of Latino culture. And there's songs that literally like everyone knows, even if they're from different countries, because there's certain artists that are, very popular internationally. So you go to a party and people just break out in song and everyone knows the same song. So I think my observation as a part of the culture, it's just very, very present. So it's really hard to ignore. And it's really hard to learn Spanish without having that component, because you'll find yourself in many social situations where you're completely lost because it's such a part of how people live their lives. In Latin American countries, in the Caribbean especially, music is just ever present. So it's really difficult to separate the two. And for me, because that was sort of my gateway into the language, I got a lot of insight into the people that speak it as well, and not just sort of, oh, I'm really good at grammar, right? It was, I have an understanding of why, sort of people are the way they are, and why the cultural norms are the way they are through the music. So for me, you can't separate Latino culture from its music, and there's so much transmitted, so much meaning transmitted through the music, and of course, through the vehicle of language. So it all really ties together.
It is interesting, isn't it? When you ask the question, what does music have to do with language? The answer may be more or less clear. But then if you ask the question, imagine that you removed language from the music. So music was no longer a part of Spanish or Portuguese in the case of Brazil. It's impossible. It just doesn't work. You take music away from Brazilians or music away from Cubans, and you don't have the culture anymore. So no. It's almost like it's something. The idea of what music means to a language can kind of be crystallized by imagining what it would be like if that were removed. And I mean, I guess you could make the same argument for any culture. I mean, what would America be without rock and roll? What would the UK be without kind of Beatles and all that kind of the music from that time? I think it's a bit different because we don't have. I mean, it's very important culturally, but I don't know what it's like there. But you don't go to house parties here and find people, dancing around before dinner. It just doesn't happen. Right. And if they, to the extent that they do, it's with a beer in one hand and kind of just leaning against the wall. It's not exactly a highbrow, deep culture or anything. I kind of had my major interaction with this in Brazil with Portuguese rather than with Spanish, because I learned my Spanish actually before I got into Spanish music. So when I learned to dance salsa, for example, my experience was more like, oh, the music's cool, and I also understand what they're saying. So it was kind of an easier route in. But with Portuguese, I learned my Portuguese through music by learning bossa nova and songs and things like that. So I know exactly what you mean when you talk about that expression and that passion of the music and the language. So I imagine then that with Spanish con salsa, you bring music and your experience of Spanish music and Latin music to the task of learning Spanish. Tell us about that. How do you marry those two things?
Well, it's actually quite natural the way it works, and a lot of people that are attracted to Spanish con salsa, they find the name and they've already heard Latin music, right? They already probably listened to it and they don't understand it, so it's a very natural curiosity. You're like, oh, this is interesting, and